lecture. Before we begin, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Mursal Maulana. I'm the lecturer and researcher from Transnational Business Law Department, Faculty of Law, University of Padjadjaran. Today, we are going to discuss the current development of international trade law. And fortunately, we have Professor Bryan Mercurio that has joined with us to share his knowledge and experience. And we are quite fortunate. Thank you for your time, Professor Bryan Mercurio. Before we start, I would like to introduce Professor Bryan Mercurio. Professor Bryan Mercurio is the Simon F. Ashley Professor of Law at the Chinese University of Hongkong. He also the professor at several universities, and Professor Mercurio work focus on the intersection between trade law and intellectual property right, free trade agreement, trade in services, trade relation with China, and international investment law. Professor Mercurio is also the co-author of one of the most widely used case book on the WTO and co-editor at the leading collection on bilateral and regional trade agreements. And Professor Bryan Mercurio also previously taught at the University of New South Wales and also Melbourne Uni. This is the short curriculum vitae of the Professor Bryan Mercurio. And without further ado, Professor Bryan, this is your time to present your presentation for today. The floor is yours, Professor Bryan.
Great, thank you, Professor Mursal. I'd like to thank the faculty at Padjadjaran University for bringing me here, Dean Idris, Professor Prita Pratama, and of course Lena, who I've known for a few years now. It's nice to also speak to Indonesian students. When I joined the University of New South Wales as a very young lecturer, actually my first PhD student was Indonesian, and she's teaching at another faculty now in Indonesia. So it's nice to keep the connection with Indonesia. Hopefully in future years we'll be able to do this live, but for now we'll have to get by with the recording. So thank you. It is an honor to be here today and to speak actually at, of course, a very important time in trade relations, because, well, in part because of the pandemic, but also other issues that are going on with trade relations. Okay, so I have now shared my screen, and I guess you can see that. If not, let me know. And so today, again, the topic is current developments on international trade law and governance. I will actually kind of focus a lot on, or really focus the talk on just trade relations with China in this time of global uncertainty. I'm very happy then, because I think actually that China is very important to the future of trade relations, but also in what I will try to relate is it's important for countries to react and maybe prepare for what is coming. So in the end of the lecture, what I'll try to do is to kind of give some recommendations for countries, and hopefully we can talk about that in the discussion and talk afterwards about any topic. I'm happy to answer questions on any topic dealing with trade, not necessarily what I speak on today, and maybe I can ask some questions of the students about what they've been learning, and how we can bring that all together. So, okay, if we look at the annual trade report from the WTO, they put it out every year. The 2021 report is out. And if you look back in in late 2019, actually the forecast for trade growth was pretty small at that point, 1.2% growth. Now, actually, funnily enough, they think it's going to be higher. And the reason for this, really low forecast early on was we have to look back, it seems like almost another time now, to 2019. And it's the second bullet point they hit on. Trade conflicts pose the biggest downside risk, okay? And there was, macroeconomic shocks and financial volatility as potential triggers for an increased downturn. That was basically, remember at that time, the US-China trade war was really at its hottest point, okay? And China was also essentially starting some trade wars with some other countries, in particular, Australia. So at that point, the big worry was trade policy in countries would cause a downturn. Of course, all of this became really insignificant in the first quarter of 2020, when in fact the pandemic, was the most severe thing that has hit since really the Great Depression. Now, if we look at that, what happened at that time is trade went down considerably from February, March of 2020. And the WTO at that time was expecting reductions in trade volume to be upwards of 30% for 2020. Very dire predictions. Now, if we look, 2020, if you look down near the bottom of the slide, 2020, the second quarter of 2020, trade had reduced 15%. But actually, trade ended up to be pretty resilient here. And I think as people stayed at home, and as people, maybe became bored at home, they ordered things. And so actually they ordered things online. They ordered things to be delivered. And so they decided, oh, maybe I need to remodel this, maybe I need to buy that. And so actually trade for the year was not nearly as bad as what they anticipated. So actually, if you look at the bottom bullet point, only a 5.3% reduction in trade volume and 7% in services. Very severe, of course, but actually a smaller reduction in trade than what we saw in the global financial crisis of 2029. So now, of course, we're dealing with the pandemic. Services is a difficult one because some services like online services, Netflix, things like this, have gone up, right? But some services, obviously tourism, travel, this is of course being hurt, for the foreseeable future. So services maybe depends on the sector you're in, but overall services hit a little bit harder than trade in goods. Now we still have some worrying indicators, and economic policy uncertainty is going to be a considerable factor going forward. And at the WTO, I guess you will know now that the Doha round of trade talks is really no more. It was on life support for many years, and they pulled the plug a few years ago. And so a big trade round is really not going to happen. And I think the focus at the WTO has shifted on smaller, maybe niche agreements. So maybe they will conclude negotiations revolving around subsidies for fishing. Fishing subsidies. Maybe they will conclude a agreement on e-commerce or digital trade, which I don't expect to do much, but it is there. Maybe they won't resolve it. There's larger agreements like a larger services negotiation. Probably that's not coming anytime soon. And of course, there's the big diversion, of course, of the TRIPS waiver, the waiver for intellectual property rights for vaccines and COVID treatments. That has, of course, taken away, time, monetary, and human resources away from negotiating other topics because there's only a limited number of WTO negotiators for each country and people stationed in Geneva. So that has maybe slowed some of the other negotiations down. And so nothing really, you know, from the WTO, nothing really large on the horizon, given also, you know, the appellate body is not working. The US is still not agreeing to appoint appellate body members. So, you know, if you have kind of a well-oiled machine moving like this, the WTO is somehow stuck and grinding. You know, it's not actually moving along. And I think so. What I wanted to also then really focus on here was kind of the role of China in all of this, and I think is a big role. And I think whether we like it or not, China is going to have a big role to play in the future of the WTO, and also in whether negotiations can move forward. You know, one of the big issues from a lot of well, I guess developed countries, US, EU, Japan, Korea, United Kingdom, is you know, the China's model of development and also its use of subsidies. And so this is something that is really going to shape the future of trade relations. And so we need to know something about it. So what I wanted to do in this slide was to give you kind of a rundown, which is almost an introduction and conclusion, I call it, of this this scenario. So if we look at, and I'll show you this in detail in the next few slides, but the really the root of the current state of trade relations and the failure of China and the US to resolve issues, or it actually isn't new, right? It didn't come in with Donald Trump in 2017 or 2016. It really dates back to the 1990s and the negotiations even for China to enter the WTO. China didn't enter until the end of 2001, after 15, 16 years of negotiations. And so if you look at, and I'll show you this, the main issues today are really the same issues that they had in the negotiations. They didn't really resolve them, and now they're coming back into focus. And as China is, of course, much larger and more powerful, they are more important issues now. China, for many years, in particular after it entered the WTO, really relied on the WTO in order to support its export-oriented model of development, and in order really to get wealthy. And what I mean there is the WTO, of course, we know one of the cornerstone principles is most favored nation. So China has to be treated like everyone else. And then it gets the benefit of a reduced tariff rate, right? One of the benefits for joining. And it also then, of course, can use dispute settlement to back that up. And so China really relied on this increased access to other markets, you know, to become the manufacturing powerhouse. They went up from about 2% of world trade to somewhere between 16 and 20%, right? So 16 to 20% of everything that is traded in terms of manufactured goods come from China now. And without the WTO, there's no way that would have occurred. And so, of course, we had, under the Trump presidency in the US, you'll have a trade war, right? I mean, Trump raised tariff rates on Chinese goods in a few different ways, and China retaliated. And so the US would retaliate. We had like a staircase that just leads upwards, right? You put on measures, I put on measures, you put on measures, I put on measures. And so, it led to some bad economic relations between the two, and what we call a trade war. But at the end, I mean, China, I think, was extremely worried about a trade war. It was extremely worried that it was going to lose kind of the WTO certainty of the principles as well as dispute settlement. If the US doesn't follow the rules, then others may not either, and China could actually lose a lot of what they gained. And so they wanted to negotiate with the US. They ended up reaching an agreement, which was signed rather, poor timed in January 2020. But I think when it's all said and done, my position now is that China actually emerged from the trade war feeling very confident, and it believes now that it's negotiating in a position of strength. The US really threw everything it could at China. And I think China looks at that now and says, we withstood it and we came out pretty strong. In fact, they think it hurt the US more than it hurt them. And so China's very confident now, right? They took the punch and they're still standing. And I think for this reason, my thesis here then is that China is in no rush to reestablish WTO predictability. What do I mean there? I think that in order for the multilateral system, in order for the WTO really to move forward, to be, to not be in a state of uncertainty, it needs all the leaders, it needs the US, it needs the EU, it needs China, India, Brazil, Japan to be leaders, to push for reforms and stability and to believe in the system. China will say they want, multilateral, they want the WTO to maintain legitimacy and not be in a state of crisis. But my feeling is they're in no hurry anymore. My feeling is actually right now, they realize even in these uncertain times, they're doing okay. And I think this a little bit surprised them, or I think they're doing better than they thought they would in, a trade war with the US and followed by the pandemic, which disrupts a lot. Many people were talking about trying to change supply chains, to diversify them, sometimes away from China or just to have more suppliers in case of crisis. But actually, as we see, China is still doing fine. And so I think China has switched its position a bit and is thinking now, actually, uncertainty of the WTO, it's not really hurting us that much. They're stronger than they thought they were. And with that comes some negative consequences, I think, and this could affect other countries. And this is, another country here could be Indonesia. And it's where I say China increasingly views trade as part of a larger diplomatic, economic relations and strategic relations. And so what we see lately, of course, it was with Canada and more so with Australia, countries in which have some diplomatic issues, not trade related with China, end up in a trade war or end up getting hurt by some actions that China takes that is trade related. And I think it's pretty clear this is tied up into the larger diplomatic strategic issues. So, with Australia, it's a little complicated because there were many things going on, but the final thing that really made China mad was when Australia called for investigation into the origins of COVID-19. With Canada, it of course was, Canada held the daughter of the founder of Huawei, Meng Wanzhou, and who was facing extradition procedures to the US. And of course, China basically arrested two Canadians and held them, but also took some trade actions. Canadian wheat and canola oil and things like this was being held up at the border, was being held up at the Chinese ports. So it's pretty clear that it was all tied together. Now, I think without a strong WTO, and in this era that, countries are really diverting a bit from their obligations more than they had in the past, uncertainty is going to remain the norm. And I say trade diversion, meaning, if China all of a sudden is not importing barley from Australia anymore, it's got to get barley from somewhere else. And then Australia's got to find a new buyer for its barley, right? So trade, which used to happen, if we just say simply from A to B, now we've kind of got to figure out another way of exporting or importing, depending on who we are. I mean, and we often look at this and say it only hurts, the exporter. Oh, what's the Australian barley exporter going to do? I mean, that's true, but also if you think about it, what's the Chinese importer who has formed the relationships with, the Australian barley or Australian wine, and now has to actually get something else? In most cases, they're able to do that. In some, they're not there. One of the items that China is not really bringing in from Australia anymore is lobster. And, very high value good, but not every, country in the world has waters that are amenable to lobsters or have high quality lobsters that they can export. Last time I looked at, I think China had replaced about 2% of that market, which of course means the price of lobster in China will have shot up because there's a lot less available. And in the end here, what I say is like sitting back and watching is not really the best option for countries, for third countries. Sitting back, waiting for something to happen and then reacting is probably not going to put you in the best position to succeed and not to be, knocked out in this climate. Okay, and I'll come back to that point at the end. So if we look at the US-China trade war, I mean, we have a number of issues which took the lead, which, the causes, you can say. For Donald Trump, he was very concerned about trade imbalance, meaning, of course, that the US imports much more from China than China imports from the US, right? So that every year, essentially, the US, in his ways, is handing money to China because it's importing a lot more than it's exporting. And of course, China has a trade, well, many countries, most countries have a trade deficit with China, meaning they're importing more than they're exporting. Also, of course, the US is a little concerned with China's model of state-led development. I mean, in some ways, this is a political system, but also it's how it is embodied in the economic development platform. Most importantly here is the use of subsidies and the use of state-owned enterprises. The use of state-owned enterprises essentially to grant subsidies that would otherwise be illegal if the government did it. And due to a WTO ruling, appellate body ruling of a few years ago, many countries are very unhappy with this because they said that WTO ruling means that that the system can't deal with China now. Intellectual property protection, technology transfer, other two issues of importance. China, they say, stealing technology or forcing it to be transferred and then used against the others. Exchange rate, so currency. The accusation is China keeps a low currency so that its exports are cheaper, so that, of course, they can break into the market and get market share. And then the last two are really kind of procedural issues or the transparency of laws. What is the law? What's the environment that we're going to? It's not very transparent and not very consistent. So in essence, though, I think and I'll say this when I move on, I think the US felt that China was going to transition to a full market economy after they joined the WTO. And that didn't really happen. And, you know, in essence, I think China's failure to transition to a market economy is one of the reasons we see this trade war. Also, of course, there was a hope, and I'll get to this soon, there was a hope that, you know, China's entry into WTO would lead to political and social reform. And I think, you know, of course, that hasn't really happened. So this is just a timeline of some of these, you know, tariffs imposed from 2018 and 19 that, you know, what the US did and then what China did to retaliate, etc. And so what we see, I'm not going to go over it. I'll make my slides available. You can look later if you want. But what we see is a mixture of measures taken solely against China, so China-specific measures. You know, then we also see some broader measures that apply to China, but to other countries that were taken, the US said, for national security reasons or for safeguard purposes. I'm not sure if you've studied trade remedies yet. So dumping and subsidies and safeguards. So the US took a lot of safeguard action here as well. Oops, sorry. So if we go back, you know, and we look at China's accession to the WTO, and accession to the WTO is not easy, right? You have to agree to the full set of WTO rules, but then you have to negotiate market access in goods and services with other interested parties. And, you know, China, like some other new members of the WTO, Russia and even some smaller countries, agreed to what we call WTO plus and WTO minus rights. So not only did, of course, you know, China reduce its tariffs on industrial, but also agricultural goods, it agreed to these WTO plus and WTO minus. So WTO plus provisions impose more stringent disciplines than are required by the WTO. So what, you know, China agreed to was actually a lot related to transparency. They agreed to be reviewed by the transitional review mechanism every year instead of every 3 years, which is the norm. They also agreed, quite interestingly, for technology transfer not to have what they call performance requirements of any type. This is as a condition for approving foreign investment. This is generally seen in bilateral investment treaties, but not necessarily in trade agreements, but it is in that. And China also agreed to be bound by what we call WTO minus provisions. So essentially agreed to be discriminated against in certain circumstances. A lot of these revolved around trade agreements. So China agreed to be treated as a non-market economy for so many years after entering the WTO, a non-market economy for trade remedy purposes. Of course, China got a lot, right? They get legally enforceable rights, they get market access, they get a voice in the negotiations, you know, including the Doha round, including the trade facilitation agreement, e-commerce. They get access to dispute settlement, and they get the opportunity to show global leadership in trade diplomacy and to have influence and to increase its influence, not only in the trade sphere, but also geopolitical sphere as well. Okay, so if we look at, you know, when China started the WTO negotiations, it was actually in 1986, and it's really a different world for China in 1986, right? It was very poor, and it was really interested in following, it had only opened up really to the world 6 or 7 years before, and it was interested in following an export-led development model that we say the Asian tigers had used, so that Japan had used in Korea, Taiwan, Singapore and Hong Kong are slightly different because not so much manufacturing heavy export led, but the others certainly the case. And at the time, not many countries had switched their diplomatic relations from the Republic of China, Taiwan, to the People's Republic of China. So they wanted actually to resume membership. They wanted essentially a diplomatic victory. Now, the motivations really, of course, changed over time. They did not obtain the resumption of membership. They did have to negotiate new, and of course, they entered at the same time. Taiwan entered as a separate member. Now, for and I just focus on the US here, but for other countries, but essentially the US, also there was a motivation shifted over time. So originally, in 1986, this is going to be way before most of you students, or really all of you students, were born. Unfortunately, I was born. I would much rather be younger, but anyway, that's a different topic. Then there was still the Soviet Union. There was still East Germany and West Germany. All of the Eastern Bloc countries were all very communist. The idea in 1986 was that China's move to market reforms and accession to WTO could serve as a model for other communist countries. So China really opened up a little bit before not only the Soviet Union, but also the other Eastern European countries. Now, of course, that becomes less relevant or almost irrelevant after like 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, 1991, kind of Soviet Union crumbles. So that reason is not really there anymore by the mid-1990s. Also, commercially, China was insignificant in 1986. It wasn't a major trader, it wasn't a major importer, but of course, over the next 15 years, things changed, right? The business community saw all of these market access opportunities. They saw a pot of gold, and the pot of gold is, the big consumer base, the potential consumers that they saw. The pot of gold is the cheap labor that if they want to move a factory, open a factory in China, right, that there's a lot of labor, and when there's a lot, it's going to be cheaper, etc. So China's expectations are really, they wanted to increase exports, they wanted to improve economic growth, and they wanted to reduce poverty. And there's a little bit of a question whether they wanted political and social reform to follow. To be honest, I think it depends on which government official you would have spoken to at the time. I don't think it was certainly government policy, but the first three definitely. The US expectations, I think we can say Western expectations or other members, were first peace. It's pretty true that when countries trade a lot together, they don't go to war, right? And so the idea of bringing China into the system was one of peace as well. Also political reform, of course, and economic reform. And we can see this, you probably won't be able to read this slide very much, but in the US, many US statements, and this is just from Bill Clinton, all in 2000 in different speeches. And it's essentially he's trying to sell the idea, I think, to US Congress of bringing China into the system. And so he talks about, that economic freedom can follow, and it'll help the environment and labor standards, human rights, rule of law. It will increase benefits of cooperation, cost of confrontation. The US can have a positive influence on China. It will bring security, advanced values. The Chinese people will be liberated and we can work without restraint and live without fear, etc., etc. So you can see a lot of, of these statements that wrap around peace, political reform, and economic reform, all in these, statements from Bill Clinton. Even this last one I did, China, reform in China and peace in the world. It will open new doors of trade for America and new hope for change in China. So the US is seeing also the benefits that they can have, right? Not only, of course, Chinese benefits. And, I thought about this for a long time. And I thought, did Bill Clinton actually believe what he was saying? or was he just trying to sell it? And I really think now at the highest level, the US did believe that bringing China into the global economy would contribute to world peace. And I think they believed it would lead to political reform. Now, that may have been a valid belief at the time, right, in 1990s, 2000. But as we see, this is not how it played out, right? Now, if we look back, we think that would be a silly, view to have. I think the US did view joining the WTO and advancing towards a freer market economy or market economics would lead to democracy. And in fact, Clinton's predecessor, I don't have it on the board, but George Bush, when he was speaking about this, his successor, not predecessor, successor, the next president, George Bush, when he was speaking about this, he said, no nation on earth has discovered a way to import the world's goods and services while stopping foreign ideas at the border. Well, I think China has done that, right, in a lot of ways. And, there was no internet back. The internet was not as developed as it is today, but in fact, they've still done a way to kind of resist the political reform and in fact, maybe consolidate power around the party. So if we look at the expectations for economic reform, we have a number of things I put on the board, right? Like trade liberalization, protection of IP, reduced role for state-owned enterprises, reduced use of subsidies, greater transparency, greater predictability, market-oriented reforms, including currency, and a transition to a domestic model of consumption away from export-oriented. So I think the belief was while China might use export-led growth to launch its economic development, it would eventually transition to a model based on domestic consumption. Now, if you look at this and you were paying attention earlier, what you will see is almost every one of these issues were the main issues in the trade war in the last few years. So the US expectations of reform in the early 2000s, 1990s, when they're negotiating China's entry, were all about what they thought would happen. And here's what they thought would happen. But if we go back, what was the cause of the trade war? The fact that a lot of this didn't happen, right? The fact that China didn't meet the US and its EU as well at the time, expectations for reform. So if we go to the bottom first in the US objectives, there is a peace dividend. I mean, even though US and China relations sometimes combat, I mean, God forbid, if there was a war, both economies would be destroyed very quickly. So there'd be a huge cost to both countries to go to war. And so I think that does help prevent war from occurring. The idea of political reform, this did not happen, right? Ideas remain regulated. And I think, can you say the US benefited American business and consumers? Yes, definitely. I think some consumers don't realize they benefit. They like to buy cheap stuff, but they don't really understand, I think, the economics behind it. And they would say they haven't benefited, but I think they did. But of course, there's losers, right? There's losers. If you're bringing in a flood of cheaper goods, it means your own factories are not going to be as competitive, and it means that some are going to close and people are going to be out of jobs. And I think that's what we saw occurred in the last 20 years. Some of it as the result of China, some of it as the result of technological advancements, but a lot of manufacturing jobs in the US and EU have closed. Now, if we look just very briefly, we can see that China basically met its expectations. Its increase in exports jumped. It's now the #1 exporter in the world, right? Economic growth has grown 8-fold since accession. It's the second largest economy in the world now. And it's managed to lift 400 million people out of extreme poverty in this time. I mean, that's an extraordinary figure. It really is an extraordinary figure. You know, I think that life, if you look at like 3 generations, if you look at your parents and your grandparents, yes, I think your life is different and maybe easier. You could even say better, you know, not as hard as your grandparents' life, right? But I think that for most Chinese, particularly if you're on more the Eastern coast, I think the life of the grandparent and the life of the grandchild are almost nothing like each other. How one grew up and how one is growing up. Their expectations in life, not the same, right? Not the same. You know, because of course, everything that older generation has gone through, you know, since really 1950 in China. So very different, you know, very different life. Political reform, of course, didn't happen, right? Political reform didn't happen, but I don't know if that was an expectation among Chinese leaders or not. As I say, I think it kind of depends on who you ask. Now, one important effect here on the WTO system is China's participation in the WTO. And if we look, China, when they joined in 2001, basically kept silent. They didn't say much for many years. Okay, they didn't bring cases against people. Nobody really brought dispute settlement cases against China. Actually, this was a big mistake. It allowed China to learn how to use the system. And I think in retrospect, you know, on day one, countries should have brought disputes against China and say, you're not following the rules, right? We're not going to give you any 5-year free time. You know, you agreed that you would change your laws to X and you haven't done it. You know, we bring a case against you, but they didn't. So China really watched. And even in meetings, if you look at minutes of meetings are available, they didn't really say anything. They didn't really throw power around. And it makes sense though, because their exports were growing so fast. They were displacing a lot of domestic manufacturing, not only in rich world countries, in Latin America, in Africa, right? In Asia. I'm sure if we look at trade statistics between China and Indonesia, I'm sure from 2001 to 2010, there was an explosion of Chinese imports into Indonesia, and probably some industries that were negatively affected by that. So China understands that many economies are almost wholly dependent on it now for economic growth. And so it doesn't really try to push many things. You know, China's best case scenario is to go back to 2015. Go back to the status quo when nobody's, you know, just leave them alone, let them grow and let them get rich, right? But things change kind of, you know, when Trump came in. They will definitely defend their interests, but they don't really push offensive interests. They don't want to get developing countries offside because they know, again, that developing countries have a uneasy relationship with China. And so it's funny, China does not position themselves like India and Brazil, who basically try to be the leader of the developing countries and to speak for every developing country. I think China realizes it's different, and that if it did that, it would be, you know, people would say, wait a minute, you're a developing country, but you're literally the world's #1 exporter, right? You are not like most developing countries, right? So actually it's interesting, they champion certain causes, but really only if they have an interest. but they really do not try to speak for the developing world. I think that's a real big point of difference between China and India and Brazil. And in fact, if you look, on the TRIPS waiver, the waiver for intellectual property rights relating to COVID, India and South Africa put it forward. But if you try to find statements from China from October 2020, when this proposal was put forward, for the next 6-7 months, you find very little. China did not say anything. They did not support it. They did not oppose it, but they were just quiet. I think they didn't know what to say. And they knew that if they would speak, somebody would get upset. So they chose not to speak. And it was only after the US shifted its position that then China issued a statement and says, yes, now we're for it as well. It's very interesting diplomacy there. Normally, China doesn't do soft power very well, but here I think they played it right. Wait for others to take a position and then follow. Unfortunately, I think China was a very hesitant leader. Everything I've said so far, they don't want to be a leader. They just want to be quiet in the shadow. Don't pay attention to us. But in 2008, it was the first time they had to sit at the big table. And they got promoted from the kids' table to the adult table. And that was the Doha round almost concluded. It was the closest time we had to almost concluding that round was in the middle of 2008. And there were a couple of issues that were still to be resolved. Many people blame India, actually, for not concluding that deal. India tried to change something at the last second. And the US said, well, we'll only agree to that if China reduces increases market access for agriculture now. And China didn't agree, right? So then whole thing collapsed, right? And now we're in the state we are in the WTO. I'm conscious of the time, so I'll only take a few more minutes. So I think that when you look at some of these criticisms, many of them, of course, are, as I said, we saw in the 1990s or early 2000s, but some of which has shifted in the sense that, a lot of people now would say, they used to say China doesn't follow the WTO rules. But now in the last few years, what we've seen is a little bit of a change to say, well, the rules allow China to do these things we don't think are fair, right? So now we have two things coming in. One, we think China needs to change, but two, we also think the system needs to change. And of course, changing the system is going to be very difficult because every country has to agree. So we have these really same criticisms that I mentioned before, some of which I will say, when you look at this, you can say, are these claims true? Are they relevant? And also, do they only apply to China? Is China the only one that mixes foreign policy with trade relations? No, I think you could say in a lot of ways, the US does that too, in a different way than China does. Are they the only ones who try to circumvent rules? No, it's just that they're maybe pretty good at it. So I think they are a challenge and challenging, because in any WTO agreement, you have to get China to agree. And, if you try to change the rules on subsidies and simply say, hey, it's obvious we don't like what you're doing, we're going to change the rules so you can't do it anymore, why would China sign up to that? They're going to say, I like the current rules. You can't force a change on me. Why would China sign up? So I think the real difficulty is going to be going to get China and India and the EU and the US and Brazil, and Japan, and Indonesia, very important, very big country, right? To agree to changes And sometimes these changes may not be in your interest. So why would you agree? And you would agree because you're given something in return that you think is in your interest. And so the real big challenge for trade, for WTO and for trade negotiators in the next few years is going to be trying to figure out that balance. We need countries to agree to things that everyone knows is not in their interest in order to push the WTO forward. But what are we going to have to trade off? And this kind of goes back to my original point that I tried to make, where I said China feels stronger now than before the trade war. Because I think China is in no mood to agree to anything. They're not going to allow themselves to be bullied or just to say, okay, you're putting something on the table, so I'm going to automatically agree to it. No, of course not. Not now. I don't need changes, and I don't really need the WTO to keep my exports up. And so this is kind of problem. This is kind of problematic. The last thing I wanted to hit on is, and you don't have to read all of this, but you know, this, as the US-China trade war kind of came to the end with this agreement in 2020, which is now being discussed again between China and the US, their relations are still very frosty. Now relations between China and the EU is very, very cold. And of course, there is a hot trade war with Australia. Now, if you look, this is a very quick timeline, and I include anti-dumping investigations here, which may or may not be. I think China certainly did not like that there were a lot of investigations against them. So if you look at early 2020, there's a lot of Australian anti-dumping investigations. And you have certain types of retaliation from China. So the red is Australian actions, the blue is Chinese actions. And so you have a lot of anti-dumping investigations. You have the call for the probe into the origins of coronavirus. Then you have China banning imports of certain types of meat. You know, China putting on really quite high anti-dumping duties of barley. And then if we keep going, you see actually a lot turn to blue, and the green, I say, is kind of neutral. Yes, I think, actually, let me just finish this point, then I'll call you. And so, you know, it's really quite interesting what has happened in this trade war. And this is a kind of a caution to Indonesia and to others. I mean, if you look, Australia was exporting 3 million tons of coal a month to China in October 2020. And by December, in winter, of course, when countries need coal for heating, zero. From 3 million to zero. Likewise, the US, who, of course, because of a trade war, was exporting zero to China, its exports are going up. And we can look at this with barley, we can look at this with many, many other issues. And so it's quite interesting what we see happening. This is what I call trade diversion, right? And this creates uncertainty in trade, not good for countries, but not good for traders either. We have the same thing probably about to occur with the EU. So EU and China agreed on a mini kind of treaty called the CUHK, which is the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, which is an investment and services agreement. But then their diplomatic relations immediately after signing it become very bad. And now they have sanctions on both countries, diplomatic sanctions. EU Parliament is not going to ratify that agreement. And I expect that European goods are going to become stopped at the border soon. I'll just finish and then I'll go to your two questions. I see two hands up because this is the last slide. This is the last slide, and then I'm on a roll. And okay, so this comes kind of to that final, well, what do countries do? And what do, you know, third countries do, right? What do countries like Indonesia do? Actually, you know what? Let me go back one or two slides. When I show those statistics, when you're in a trade war, it's funny. Sometimes governments don't, I think, understand how trade occurs, and I think governments, and I used to be a negotiator, so I know this. Governments assume, you know, if we can get a little cheaper price, all the importers will switch, right? They have a 5% tariff. If we can get to 0 tariff, then we're going to win. But, you know, if you're shut out of the market for 3, 4, 5 years due to trade restrictions, just because the market is open to you 5 years later doesn't mean you're going to get your market share back. You know, China has really taken, really just is now importing no Australian wine. Chinese drinkers are going to go to something else, right? They're going to go to New Zealand or South African or European or whatever, American. And in 3, 4, 5 years, when Australian wine is on the shelf again, are they really going to go buy it? Maybe, but they haven't had it for so many years. They've acquired a taste for something else. Maybe they stick with it, right? So shutting you out, even for a short time, could actually have a long-term effect. So the conclusions here are on the board. I think unpredictability is going to remain for some time. The WTO, return to WTO agreement treaty is going to be far in the future. I think countries need to cooperate on broad initiatives, encourage, you know, and try to influence the Quad, the main negotiators. So this is a role for Indonesia. It's a role for middle powers. It's a role for countries that really aren't the US, EU, and China, really. I think that in a dispute, what we see is do not expect others to back you. This is a big lesson. And we see it from Australia and the US trade numbers. If China bans Australian goods, the US farmers are going to fill it, regardless if the US has had a trade war. If China bans the US, somebody else is going to fill it. You know, it's not a team. Everyone is for themselves, right? So nobody's going to say, everyone's going to say, boy, China should not have taken that action against you. And then they're going to fill the order, right? So they're not going to hurt their own farmer, their own manufacturer, because of something that China did to another country. So I think countries need to continue their own domestic reform. And I say, play the game. Secure as many market access possibilities as you can, but don't assume these gains are permanent, because right now in this environment, things can change. It's probably better to diversify if you're an exporter right now and not rely on one market, because things can change. But there's an opportunity. Try to usurp leadership, right? You know, negotiate smaller agreements and try to direct them. The opportunity to direct them is there now for countries like Indonesia, where it wasn't in the past because it was dominated by some of the larger players. But sitting back and watching and not planning is probably the worst thing I think countries can do. So with that, I'm going to end, and I am going to call on Mr. Labib. You have your hand up and your camera on, so I'll call on you first.
Okay. Thank you, Prof. Bryan, for your presentation. This is quite interesting topic, and today we have two students that has raised hand for the question, and also we have a student that raised the question by using chat box. And for the first sessions, perhaps Labib can deliver your question first to Professor Bryan. The time is yours, Labib.
Thank you, Mr. Mursal. Hello, Professor Mercurio. My name is Labib Pajadi. My student's number is 190-183. I'm just saying that so that Mr. Mursal can add bonus points on my score sheet. First of
Yeah, I
all, I
figured
really
that. I figured
commend.
that.
There is this strategy from the student.
Yeah. First off, I really commend your pronunciation of Padjadjaran University because yeah, I've seen other white people try to pronounce it. They failed miserably. Okay, I'm not exactly like a trade expert or even an expert in law. I'm just a third year law student. I think my question is more so more of a simpler version of what you have just presented. The thing about the trade wars and the Trump cabinet, we all know that around this transition presented your material was that when Trump were to do a trade war on China, they actually took the punch and actually came out on top. So I'm actually asking you whether or not this treatment, the transition from Trump to Biden would actually do better than what Trump did, as in like akin to like a tough love from a parent. Which one is preferred, with a tough love from a parent or a spoon-fed childhood? I think that's my question for now.
It's a very good question, and I commend you for putting it actually so eloquently as well, and thanks for my for the compliment on the pronunciation. I did practice a bit this morning, but not too much. It's a great question, and I think that what we have seen is in the US right now, as I think in many countries, being tough on China is popular, and it plays well no matter if you're on right wing or left wing. It plays well with farmers. It plays well with consumers. And to be perfectly frank, Biden hasn't changed anything. He has changed the tone. He does not, tweet. He does not yell. But all of the sanctions are still there. All right, the what they call Section 301 sanctions, the 232, the national security ones, they're still there. And so it's interesting that he has a different tone, but essentially the same policy. And in speaking now, just last week, right, the U.S. trade rep spoke after an 8-month review. And to be honest, it was very disappointing because to me, she didn't say anything new. She just said, we're going to keep all of our options on the table, and they're not going to remove the sanctions. And they're going to look at that phase 1 trade agreement that US and China reached and basically tell China that they didn't meet the obligations. So it's the exact same thing Trump would have done. Actually, Trump would have probably done it sooner. So yeah, I've tried to speak to my Chinese friends and some contacts, and it's interesting because some of them actually say they'd rather deal with Trump because they say, you know what you're dealing with. He's going to tell you to your face, and whereas the Biden administration will smile to you, but you don't really know their underlying motive and what they're trying to get out of it. So I think that I think what this tells me again is it's still uncertain, and it means that nothing is going to get resolved anytime soon. But certainly it's really in some respects a continuation, even though it appears to me that China really didn't get that hurt, and the US consumer is paying more for certain goods, and there are shortages of other goods. It still is a very popular policy, so it will remain.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Bryan, for your answer. And now we have Shifa Adila. And Shifa, perhaps you can you have raised your hand, and the floor is yours to deliver your question to the Professor Bryan.
Hello, Professor. I'm Shifa Adila. However, I can't really turn on my camera right now because my internet's quite laggy. However, I would like to ask a question about the effect of the US-China trade war that is producing a ripple effect throughout the Asian economies. In particular is Hong Kong. And because of this, I'm wondering about Hong Kong's US exports labeled as made in China in the US back during Donald Trump's times again.
Hmm.
And I'd like to know the spillover effect of this forced labeling, or as I heard of, is a forced labeling to Hong Kong, and what kind of economic dislocations this could give rise to both the US, China, and maybe to Hong Kong. I'm highly interested in this topic. I would like to get also some brownie points from my professors and would like to know more from your perspective. Thank you.
Sure, I will talk to them and make sure you get brownie points as well. Now, yeah, this is an interesting one. And of course, I mean, Hong Kong gets, is caught in the middle here because of course, you know, China has sovereignty over Hong Kong. We have the system they call one country, two systems after the handover from the British to Chinese in 1997. You know, China really had a very, very hands-off approach for many, well, years, almost maybe 2 decades, a little bit more. So Hong Kong is a member of the WTO. It has its own trade policy, trade laws. You know, there's no tariffs. We have no tariffs on anything, but we have very, very little manufacturing, right? And as its own member, right, goods are generally labeled made in Hong Kong as opposed to made in China. And of course, the China-specific tariffs did not apply to Hong Kong. Now, what Trump did kind of in the aftermath of a lot of the Hong Kong protests and crackdowns in Hong Kong, which have certainly taken place, is one thing is to say, well, you know, Hong Kong is not really independent anymore. They can't actually have their own policy. They're really just part of China now. So we're going to treat them as part of China for trade as well. Now, interestingly, the original announcement of treating Hong Kong like China and having the goods labeled made in China was that, in fact, the goods coming from Hong Kong would also face the Chinese tariff rates. Now, actually, about a week later, that was taken away. You know, that didn't get headlines in the press like the original announcement did. But it's very interesting because what they've done is now goods from Hong Kong have to be labeled made in China, but they are not subject to the additional tariffs. They still get the Hong Kong rate. Now, that was actually a very smart move from the US, because if you charge the China rate to Hong Kong, it's a very clear WTO violation. Hong Kong is its own member. And as long as it is its own member, it should get the most favored nation rate. If you think that Hong Kong should no longer be a member, then go to the WTO and try to kick them out, right? But as long as they are still a member, that's a clear violation. So they took it away. They never imposed the additional tariff, but still goods have to be made labeled in China. I actually worked with a manufacturer who wanted to comply, but also thought that it would, you know, maybe he needed to differentiate a bit. So what we came up with was a nice little way of saying on the package, you know, made in China, and then underneath it, actually in bigger font, in a factory located in Hong Kong. And so the idea there was he really wanted to let people know that it wasn't, you know, a mainland Chinese good. We'll see if this stays on. Hong Kong has filed a dispute at the WTO after the US really didn't give the Hong Kong delegation much time to talk beforehand. And so Hong Kong did file a case. I suspect Hong Kong will lose, I suspect the US will lose that case, but it's a very interesting one because, and this is about politics too, one of the arguments from Hong Kong is it has to be that there's reputational damage caused by the made in China label over the made in Hong Kong label. But, you know, we are one family, and really, you know, China's the mother or the father, and we're the kid. Can the kid really argue that being called the mother or father is a reputational damage? Like, politically, this is going to be very sensitive, I think. And some people are saying, you know, hey, this is going to air some dirty laundry that maybe Hong Kong isn't doesn't have as independent policy as we claim. So we'll see. I didn't actually think Hong Kong would file a case, but they did.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Prof. Bryan. This is another issue. It is not only relation between the US and China, but also we need to consider the relationship between China and Hong Kong too. And this is, now we have two other students that have raised the question. And the first, we will give the floor to the Gregory Joshua. To Gregory, please. The floor is yours to deliver your question.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mosal. Good morning, Professor Mercurio. My name is Gregory Joshua. Also, like Labib previously, I hope I will get an additional point for the question. So, is it okay if I ask a bit different from the topic you previously mentioned regarding trade wars between Australia, US, and China? But it is pretty related. So previously, European Union has filed a case before the WTO dispute settlement because of Indonesia's ban on nickel exports to the EU. But on the other hand, we can see that based on the news I've read before, China took it easier with Indonesia regarding the export and import of nickel. So I would like to ask about Indonesia is presently, especially in the cabinet of Mr. Joko Widodo, our current president, is pursuing a huge potential or foreseeable future for our mineral and also mining industry in Indonesia, because we have built several smelters, or we are building several huge smelters in Indonesia. But on the other hand, we cannot also just cut off the relationship or trade relationship with other countries in the world, especially the European Union. So what do you suggest for countries like Indonesia that are pursuing huge domestic potential for mining exploration and also mining industry, but on the other hand, they don't want to cut a good relationship with other countries? For example, in what happened before the dispute settlement body in WTO right now. That's my question. Thank you very much.
Yeah, look, you're continuing a trend of good questions. So I'm very impressed at the level of questions. You know, if I had the answer to that, I'd probably be a rich and powerful man, because that's the $1 million question for countries caught in the middle. You know, how do you stay friends with the West, enter a commercial relationship with China? I mean, I'm a very blunt person, so I'm going to be blunt here. And in fact, I've worked with ASEAN on trade and services since 2013. So I know the Indonesian negotiators well, and really all of those countries' negotiators in services. And I think, you know, the general point that I get from most of them when we talk about China is, I mean, everyone wants to commercialize a relationship, but I think everyone is hesitant to really call China a good friend. Let's say that. I think they think that China may be more interested in the exploitation factor than the friendship factor in the long term. I think there's a very big hesitance to really trust China. Now, whether that's true or not, and true in the future, who knows? But as of right now, and so and you encapsulated that really by saying, you know, how can we essentially, you know, stay friends with both? And this is tough because, and I think it's especially tough for Indonesia, because Indonesia is a big country, right? And there's a big consumer market. There's lots of potential. There's natural resources. It's not actually a very small, maybe to be offensive here to others, but it's not small and insignificant, right? It has interests, and it has strategic, not only trade, but strategic interest of both China and EU, US as well. And I think with a country of that size, and that does want to be also industrial in some ways, and as you were talking about with the mining, it takes on a heightened level of importance, but that actually makes things harder, right? And, you know, when Indonesia tries to have an industrial policy, it's going to upset another country. It just is a given, right? Another one's going to say, wait, you're keeping my goods out because of your industrial policy here, whether it be an internet policy or whether it be mining. I think right now, you know, it's probably the mining, it's a good time to be friends with China. China is really looking to diversify away from Australia at this point in that sector. And I think it's looking both to Southeast Asia and then also to Africa for this. I think that the good thing is, with most trade disputes with Europe and the US, it doesn't end the relationship. It really is just a trade dispute, right? Like, I mean, with Australia, there's a trade dispute between, you know, A4 copy paper, right? Paper, anti-dumping duty against Indonesian paper. I mean, this is not going to hurt the relationship, right? I mean, I think that, you know, there are certain moves. I mean, more so Malaysia with palm oil, but I think that Indonesia is not very happy with the European Union as well. You know, in terms of the palm oil issue, and obviously, as you mentioned about minerals and mining as well. These are going to be issues that are going to remain. I think they're going to even become more difficult when the EU puts on their border tax adjustment for carbon emissions, what they call the CBAM. If that actually comes into being, I think there's going to be a heck of a lot of protests from Asia. But it's, you know, it's just managing. I think it's managing. You know, it almost goes back to my last slide. And I mean, it really kind of hits it. Try to play the game. Try to secure as many market access possibilities. Don't assume that those gains are going to be permanent. You know, keep looking, keep trying to think about potential scenarios and how to react if those scenarios come true. As I say, in this climate of uncertainty, I think the worst thing to do is just to sit back and assume that what you have now is going to remain. And that's it, right? So it's really, I think, from the country, but also the company level, really trying to play out future scenarios in your mind to say, hey, what are we going to do if?
Thank you so much, Professor Mercurio, for that.
Professor Mercurio, we also received a question from the chat box. This is from the Chandra. Chandra raised the question regarding to the appellate body mechanism that isn't work right now in the WTO, and also what do you think about the China suing the US over the unilateral imposition of the 2 rounds of the trade war tariff, but the lack of the appellate court system? What is the future like that?
Yeah, it's a good question too, and I think that you know, right now we have a lot of diplomatic games going on. I think that in some cases you have, in this case, China bringing a case against the US and also US against China. Even if they win at the panel level, you're right. The other side can just appeal, what we call appeal into the void, and then the decision can never be implemented, no sanctions can be put on, etc. But still, I think, you know, as a country, and you're making the point that a panel has said the other person's rules violate the international trade agreements, violate the WTO. I think there's some value in that. There's some value in saying, you know what, we won at the panel, and the only reason we can't enforce this is because you're blocking the appellate body. It actually makes China, in this case, look like the good player and the US look like the bad player. And in fact, in a recent case on barley that Australia brought against China. China lost at the panel level, and they did not appeal to the void. They agreed to use that new kind of alternate system that the EU is trying to set up. And I think they know they're going to lose as well, actually. I think China's going to lose that case at the appellate body too, but they still agreed to go to it, not just to appeal into the void. There again, I think two reasons. One, I'll give them credit, and they say they want to look like, hey, we're not blocking the system. Even if we lose, we can accept that. But when you have an anti-dumping duty in place, and then you do appeal, that duty is going to stay on 3, 4, 5 years. Even if they lose the case and then take off the dumping duty, the effect they wanted to make by putting it on already accomplished its goal. So actually it's win-win for China. The duties can stay on now, and they look like a good player for using the system.
Okay.
But actually, I could, Mercer, let me just say one more thing. I think the most disappointed I am with the Biden administration is that they did not, as one of the first acts on trade, is allow the appointment of appellate body members and to get that back on track. Instead, they've just, again, adopted the same policy as Trump. And I think that's really, really a disappointing thing for that administration.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Bryan Mercurio. Unfortunately, we come to the end of this session, Professor, because you know that the students still have another class, and before we finish this session, perhaps you can give the concluding remarks to this public lecture and give some like motivation, and you can support our students in order to they can concern more about the international trade law. The floor is yours, Professor.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, look, everything we've said, or everything I've said, and the great questions you've asked, it's really exciting for me. But also, what it should tell you is things are going on in trade now, right? Things are happening, and hopefully this either sparks your interest or leads you to continue your interest. Because what this means is there's opportunities, right? There's opportunities. I mentioned both as well, how governments and companies need to be looking out for this. With trade uncertainty, actually, to be honest, it brings disputes, it brings problems, it brings headaches, but that also means it brings opportunities for us, right? For those that are in the business, for students coming in, it means more people are going to be employed in this sector, and it becomes quite interesting, And so what I would say is it's actually a pretty good time to be getting into the field because so much is happening, and to be honest, I think so much is going to continue to be happening for the next 10 years at least in this regard. So I would encourage you to stay with it. I saw also you had a course on investment law, commercial contracts. These are all really actually quite important, particularly in times of uncertainty. So yeah, certainly I'm really pleased with, as I said, the level of questions I got, the amount of students who were attending. It's really quite gratifying. So I think if Indonesia can navigate these uncertainties, really the future is quite bright.
Thank you, Professor Bryan Mercurio. And now our head of the Department of Transnational Business Law Department, Dr. Prita Amalia SHMH, would like to give the closing remarks. And to Bu Prita, the floor is yours, Bu.
Okay, thank you, Pak Musa, for the opportunity. Thank you, Prof. Bryan, for the lecture. I really enjoy your lecture, and of course, all the students and all the lecture here, the International Trade Law lecture. Was very pleasure to and enjoy about the lecture today. In Bandung, it's a raining day, so today is 10 o'clock in the morning, but it's a rainy. So Prof. Bryan, thank you very much to have you in our class. Is really important, and hopefully this is the first and would be coming another session with you. As you know that our department has numbers of subjects that may be coming in the next semester. We have the international investment law, and we learned that that's also your expertise. Maybe we could have your sessions again in the next semester. Numbers of the students also join with the moot court on the investment law moot court, and just now we have a achievement on the international moot court on the international investment law. Further, maybe in the next discussion, the student could get the insight about the investment law from you, Prof. Bryan, in the next semester. Hopefully all the students also get the insight about the international trade law. Talks about the China and US, always interesting and still a hot topic in the international trade law area. And numbers of the students also learn the issue on the international trade law as their final assignment, Prof. Bryan, for their thesis, and as well as with the article. Hopefully they could publish as well in the national journal or international journal. Maybe they also get your article as well as with the your book. So thank you very much. And thank you for the lecture. Here we have Ibu Dr. Sinta Dewi, our senior lecturer in the international trade law. And now Ibu Sinta Dewi also privacy law expert and join with us. And also Ibu Laina as well, Ibu Helita, Pak Mursal, Pak Taufik, Pak Purnama, Pak Pupung. We have 6 classes actually in the international trade law, since this subject is a compulsory subject. And all the students this semester, we try to provide them with the numbers of the lecture from the overseas as well as from the minister and the international organizations. So thank you very much once again, Prof. Bryan. And for the appreciation, maybe we have the certificate of the appreciation for this lecture today. Lecture. Thank you very much. And my the regard from our Dean, Faculty of Law, Dr. Idris, since today they have the monitoring and evaluation for the internationalizations program. And this, your lecture would be very important as well for our ranking internationalization, since we have a collaboration internationally. So thank you once again, Prof. Bryan's. Looking forward for another collaborations with you, and stay safe, stay healthy in this very pandemic. Thank you, Pak Mursal.
Thank you, Ibu Prita, for the closing remarks for the today public lecture. And Professor Bryan, I would like to inform you that our class has used your book, and this is as the compulsory materials, and this is quite helpful for the student to understand the international trade law. You has made this book quite satisfied for them to analyze and also to learn the case law that you made in this book. And before we close this session, it would be better if we take the picture together in order to make the documentations. And I think Pak Taufik could lead us to this session. Please,
yes,
for all the students, please turn on your camera.
For all students, please turn on your camera because the photo session will begin. Okay, on my remarks, there is a 3 screen on my computer, so I will begin from the first screen. 1, 2, 3. Thank you. The second screen. 1, 2, 3. The third screen. 1, 2, 3. And the last. 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you very much, the all student and participant. The photo session has been ended. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Pak Taufik, for your help. And finally, we come to the end of this public lecture. And I would like to thank to Professor Bryan Mercurio for sharing your experience, and also your knowledge and your insight is quite important for us. And I hope this public lecture has given us the insight and current development on international trade law and government. We do hope that we could meet you in another session, Professor, and stay safe, and everyone. See you in another public lecture held by our department, and see you in the next session. Thank you for all.
Thank you.
Thank
Bu
you.
Thank you so
Laina,
much,
thank you.
Professor Bryan.
Prof.
Thank you.
Bryan, thank you very much.
It was my pleasure. It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Bu Laina.
Yeah, thank
You're
you.
always
For
welcome,
organizing.
Ibu Prita.
Terima kasih semuanya. Cinta nuhun, Bu Laina, Pak Mursa, Pak Purnama, Bu Dalita,
Ya, Bu
Pak
Sinta,
Purnama.
Nuhun.
Taufik nuhun ya.
Nuhun Pak Mursal.